Chapter 28. Agnart's Fate. For the 14 hours Reyes slept, the sun slowly disappeared behind one horizon, and after a certain amount of time, rose again on the opposite horizon, and began its slow, steady ascent into the early dawn sky. Reyes opened his eyes and let in the first light of the day. He shivered with the cold of the new day, and hoped he wouldn't have to spend too many other nights out in the open. During the night, the heat of Reyes's body had slowly melted its way through to the undergrowth, leaving a harpy-shaped imprint on the surface, and soaking his body in icy cold water. Reyes sat up and tried to rub the damp out of his limbs. He inched closer to the meagre fire, and did his best to get all vestiges of the cold out of his body. Gaggara sat cross-legged by the fire already. It seemed to be her task, whether suggested by one of the others or taken upon herself, to keep the fire going. She picked up a small log from a pile of wood that had been gathered while he had slept last night. She poked the fire with it a couple of times, and then laid the log carefully on top of the blaze. Gaggara was the only other harpy in sight. There was no sign of either Quinnigoff or Tanegi. "Sleep well?" Gaggara asked. She didn't look at him, too busy with what she was doing. "Very," Reyes agreed. Smoke from the fire seemed to be finding its way directly into his eyes, causing him to blink a few times. "I assume nothing bad happened during the night." "Well, we all survived," Gaggara volunteered. She looked at him briefly, and then poked the fire with another twig. "Surprising, really, considering the weather and how exposed we are." "We are young and hardy creatures," Reyes replied, though he must admit, having spent the night out in the freezing cold snow, he would have expected at least one of them to have come down with some kind of illness, at the very least. He wondered if maybe Mangloss had cast a spell on them to protect them. Reyes would have preferred it if Mangloss had cast a spell on them to keep them warm. "Where are Quinnigoff and Tanegi?" "Oh, I expect they're around somewhere," Gaggara replied simply. "They went hunting." She looked over towards him again, her features soft, gentle and concerned, as she asked, "Will you be able to fly much today?" "I think so," Reyes assured her. Ginny had said he needed to rest and had suggested 24 hours. Obviously that hadn't been possible at the time, considering the circumstances. On the other hand, 24 hours was just some arbitrary number that mages would occasionally pluck out of the air. After resting his wings for a mere 14 hours, he felt they were going to be fine. Slowly he unfurled his wings, extending them carefully to avoid smashing them into any of the nearby trees. Then he flapped his wings slowly once, and then twice before folding them back behind him, and telling Gaggara, "They feel fine now." "That's good," Gaggara commented, uncertain. "I guess we'll know for sure when we hit the sky again. We lost a lot of time yesterday. I don't know how long we have left before the snow begins to fall again, but there's no way we can reach Arliss before that happens." Reyes sighed and nodded. "I was stupid to make camp just because I couldn't fly." "Well," Gaggara jumped to his defence, "you weren't going to get much further with your wings the way they were." Reyes shook his head. "I could have used the horse. It didn't occur to me until just now, but I have a horse stored in my ring. I could have ridden that at a gallop while the three of you flew overhead. We could have made another 20 or more miles before the sun dropped below the horizon." "Don't worry, sweetie," Gaggara cooed. "It never occurred to me either. We are harpies. Riding horses isn't normally in our nature. It's certainly not the first thing that occurs to me when I need a break. Lindholm can't be too much further. We could have found an inn there, warmed ourselves in front of a lovely, well-maintained fire, gotten a room for the night, and maybe even accessed the painting for some decent food. I just wasn't thinking straight." "I'm not all that sure you're thinking straight now," Gaggara told him. "Remember the last time we made this trip? We avoided all the major cities. I think it would be best if we did the same this time. I don't know about you, but I don't think I want to answer any awkward questions. If we're acting as a hunting party, we should act as if we're out hunting, and not sheltering in an inn room." "I will want to stop at Sun's Blessing regardless," Reyes insisted. "Hopefully we can make that today." "Well," Gaggara replied uncertainly, "if you're sure. Though I would remind you that on our last visit we were lucky to get away with our lives." "I know," Reyes replied, inching a little closer to the fire. "I left something there I'd like to retrieve." "You're talking about your old girlfriend, aren't you?" Gaggara suggested. "Agnart," Reyes replied calmly. "Yes." "She's too old for you," Gaggara said simply. "She's beyond childbearing age." Reyes closed his eyes, feeling a little irritated. "Gaggara, sweetheart, please. Not every friendship I have with another harpy is based around whether or not they can give me a daughter. Please try to understand there was no one else for me other than you." "I know, handsome," Gaggara said teasingly. "I just like to hear you say it." It wasn't long before Quinnigoff and Tanegi returned with their latest kills, a small, scrawny badger and a baby owlet. The two creatures together barely had enough meat on them to satisfy the hunger of just one harpy. Shed between the four of them, they did little more than take the edge off. I think we may starve before we freeze to death, Gaggara commented. We're doing our best, Tanegi said by way of defence. There's simply nothing out there. I'm sure Gaggara didn't mean to criticise, Reyes interjected. I don't doubt that you were finding food where most huntresses would find nothing. When breakfast was over, the four harpies took to the sky again. For about an hour, Reyes flew as fast as his wings would carry him. The others, though capable of greater speeds, kept with him. In the time since Reyes had first learnt to fly, he had slowly gotten faster, but he was still slower than all three of those he was travelling with today. Are you going to be able to make it, my chief? Quinnigoff asked, concerned. She had taken the lead position again and was clearly having trouble ensuring that she didn't get too far ahead, as her instincts wanted her to make good time. I'll be fine, Reyes replied. He felt fresh and vibrant. At the moment he felt as if he could fly all day, and maybe even well into the night. Let's just fly while we can, and I'll let you know if I need a break. As you say, my chief, Quinnigoff commented back. She tried to concentrate on the way ahead, but kept looking over her shoulder, as if to check that Reyes was still there. It wasn't too long until the city of Lindholm hove into sight. Quinnigoff made no attempt to veer off and avoid the city. As it was, the place was hard to see until they were virtually flying over the top of it. There was a thick forest to the north, and although the elves had demolished a good part of that forest when laying siege to the city, there was still enough of it to hide the presence of the city from the four harpies flying at just above treetop height until they were virtually over the walls. The last time Reyes had been this way, they had been able to avoid the city thanks to the sound of the massive siege engines that had been deployed in the conquering of the city. They had used that sound to circumnavigate the city and stay clear of the fighting. Now the city was in elven hands, and there were no such telltale sounds. Even as they were flying over the remains of the northernmost walls of the city, Reyes commented, I'd like to give this city a miss. We should go round. It's a bit late for that, my chief, Quinnigoff called back. Besides, don't you want to cover as much ground as you can before the snow starts again? It was clear that the elves had pulled no punches when they had taken the city. The huge siege engines had cut great gouges into the outer walls, leaving little more than the occasional unstable-looking pillars of bricks that had somehow been missed. Lindholm, like the rest of Floreth, was now very much an elven city. It was hard to tell that from the virtually empty streets. The only movement of any kind seemed to be that of human slaves doing the bidding of their elven masters. However, the ownership of the city was made clear by the large number of flags that flew from many of the larger and more important buildings of the city. As it was, they had nearly reached the southern walls of the city before they even saw an elf in the streets. It was a small patrol of the local militia, just 4 men armed with spears and swords and carrying around small round shields. No harpies, Reyes commented, feeling no small amount of relief as they flew over the wall. It's too cold, Gaggara commented. Any harpy with any sense would be taking refuge in the warm until the weather starts to improve. Let's face it, we simply aren't worth getting out of bed to investigate. Reyes grinned at the thought and then smiled towards his wife. Yes, boss, Tanegi opted to comment. If any of them saw us, they would probably just think we were mad. After seeing how quiet Lindholm was, there seemed to be little point in taking any further detours just to avoid the major cities. As Quinnigoff had said, time was of the essence, and though Reyes was confident they would reach Borton before it got dark, he also thought that they would be lucky to reach Lamaze before the snow started to fall again. Carlis was a large piece of land. Not as big as Borton, but easily twice the size of Demoth, the city of Lindholm occupied the very centre of the territory, and thus made a good landmark. It took another 5 hours, taking just the occasional break, to fly through the southern half of the dukedom and reach the border city of Felmont. When do you think we should stop for lunch? Gaggara asked, as Felmont appeared on the distant horizon. They were flying over farmland as she spoke, but like a lot of farms in the country, the ground was too cold to grow anything, and the livestock had already been requisitioned by the local army. There was simply nothing down there to hunt. We can stop whenever you wish, my leader, Quinnigoff commented, looking over his shoulder as she spoke. I have to admit I'm feeling quite hungry myself, but I'd like to get a little bit further south first. Maybe the farms on the south side of the city would be better stocked. Somehow, Reyes doubted it. Why would the elves strip all the northern farms and leave the ones to the south untouched? Instead, he suggested, the inns in that city might be well stocked. We might be able to get a decent meal there. I'm not eating elven food, my chief, Quinnigoff commented, and besides, I thought you wanted to avoid actually entering the cities. It might be worth the risk, Reyes told her. At the current rate, we could starve to death on the small morsels you and Tanegi are finding for us. Even if we do make it to Arlis, I doubt we'll have enough strength for the coming battle. If nothing else, we could take a room at the inn and access the painting. We could get a decent meal that way. It might be worth the risk. Rooms cost money, my chief, Quinnigoff pointed out. They don't accept pretty stones at these places. I have money, Race assured her. As you wish then, my chief, Quinnigoff agreed. She sounded a little unhappy. Perhaps she didn't feel that the danger presented to her mail was worth the risk. Nevertheless, she kept on course towards a fast approaching city. Felmont was a large city. Admittedly, it was not in the same league as Golspon, but it was more than twice the size of Lindholm, and since Lindholm was the capital of Carlis, Felmont was the only example in the whole of Floyth where a city had grown larger than its dukedom's main city. Felmont was right on the southern border of Carlis. It was an ideal place for travellers to spend the night before pushing on into Lamais or heading north through the rest of Carlis. As a result, the city was brimming over with inns. True to form, many of the inns had been closed down since the elves had taken over. Their doors and windows were barred shut, and large planks of wood had been nailed across various orifices to keep out the looters. There were still a few places that were open, though. Inns that had been taken over by elven entrepreneurs purchasing the inns for a song and thinking they could make a small fortune by catering to the conquering army. Somehow it was always easy to spot when a building was serving as an inn. There was something about its architecture. It wasn't just a Felmont thing. Race had noticed this in every city he'd ever passed through, even Golspon. Even Quinnigoff, who, to Race's knowledge, had never set foot in an inn in her life, had no trouble recognising the right type of building. She landed on the roof of one such structure. It had a fancy sign that proclaimed itself to be the Merry Minstrel, complete with a dancing figure wearing the clothing of a troubadour and carrying a lyre by the neck in one hand. The original owners of the place had probably paid a small fortune for that sign. The new elven owners had drawn a single line through the name in white chalk. It was totally inadequate way to obliterate the original name. Then, underneath the dancing figure, someone had written in Elistran, and in very poor quality handwriting, the name The Emperor's Desire. The street immediately in front of the inn looked quite empty. In fact, the entire city looked empty. While Quinnigoff might see value in landing somewhere high up and getting a good overview of the area, Race saw no reason not to just land in front of the inn and wait for the others to join him. I've been thinking, boss, Tanegi said as she landed, looking about herself nervously as if she worried she might be overheard. What are you thinking? Race asked. Well, Tanegi coughed and looked about herself again. You hold the entire free population of... She seemed to shake and refused to actually say the name, her fear that someone might overhear her evidently being uppermost in her mind. Yes, Race replied, looking at Tanegi doubtfully. Has it occurred to you that we could... Tanegi started to say, but she stopped in mid-sentence. Perhaps it was the way he was looking at her, but suddenly she seemed to change the subject altogether. Sorry, boss, I'm being silly. Let's go and eat. Good idea, Race replied. He decided not to press Tanegi further on the subject. He had a reasonable idea of what she might have been about to say, and wasn't too sure he wanted to know. You aren't welcome here, one of the elven customers of the Emperor's Desire, nay, the Merry Minstrel, commented as Race and his three companions entered the inn. It was a nice-looking barroom. After being stuck out in the snow for so long, even a barn would have looked good to Race right now. The place wasn't all that crowded, although the entire clientele of the place, until Race and his companions entered, seemed to be elves. There was a single human behind the bar, a stumpy-looking man with very little hair and a surly complexion. The clothing he wore was little more than rags. The thing that caught Race's attention the most as he walked through the door was the large and welcoming-looking fireplace that was burning away on the wall opposite the bar. A wave of heat from that fire had hit him the moment he stepped through the entrance. It was going to be hard to get very close to the fire because there was a ring of elves covered close to it, keeping as much heat as they could to themselves. Nevertheless, it was good to be inside and offer the freezing cold streets, if only for a little while. I said you aren't welcome here. Get out, the elf who had greeted them when they first entered the inn ordered. Since Race had been the first to enter the inn, the elf singled him out and rested a hand roughly on his shoulder. If you want to keep your hand, Race instructed the elf, I suggest you move it. Quinnigoff seemed to have a little less patience for the matter than Race did. She unsheathed her claws and grabbed the offending elf by his throat, drawing just a modicum of blood with the claws of her index finger, a clear warning of what would happen if he didn't let go. Quinnigoff might not be able to speak Elistran, but she recognised an offensive gesture when she saw one. I suggest that if you wish to continue breathing, you leave us alone. The elf clearly didn't understand what Quinnigoff had said, but her intent was all too clear. He lifted his hand carefully off of Race's shoulder, his eyes on Quinagoff the whole time. Quinagoff nodded contentedly when the elf let go of Race's shoulder. She then relinquished her grip on the elf's throat, sheathed her claws, and stepped past the elf as if he wasn't there, as if he wasn't worthy of any further attention. Then she turned her back on him, as if he was of no threat at all, merely a nothing. Race reached the bar and studied the barman, trying to judge the man. Clearly he was an elderly man, possibly in his late 60s, and thus had avoided being taken to Arlis or Elistran for resale as a slave. The man had a short, greying, scruffy beard, as of a man who hadn't bothered to shave since the elves had invaded. There was a touch of hatred in his eyes. It was the kind of hatred that suggested the man couldn't be under the influence of any enchantment. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he said casually, not seeming to care that Race might not understand the language. "He wants to know what you want," one of the elves standing by the bar translated. Race glanced briefly at the elf who had just spoken and then turned back to the barman. "Just water, old man. Water for me and my 3 sisters. The eyes of the elf widened a little as Race spoke a few words of flourish, and then he smiled as he said, "I guess you don't need me." Race glanced at the elf, appraising him. In Race's experience, no matter how the majority of the elven population might feel about those who weren't elven, any of them who had bothered to learn a language that wasn't of elven derivation tended to be a lot more accepting of other races. "I appreciate your help, nonetheless." "Yes, ma'am," the barman replied unhappily. Race looked around at Gaggara. "Water all right, m'sweet?" Gaggara nodded happily. "Water for me too, my chief," Quinagoff commented. "Me too," Tanegi added. The barman returned with 4 tankards and a couple of pitchers. He set them down, pouring out some drinks. Behind him, Race could hear the elf who had greeted Race and his friends by the door, trying to stir up trouble for the harpies. "We can take them. There's only 4 of them," he was saying. "4 harpies," someone replied. "Huntresses," someone else voiced. "Feel free to commit suicide if you want," a third suggested, "but don't go dragging us along with you." Race did his best to ignore the conversation. "What do you have to eat?" he asked of the barman. "Who prepares the food here?" "The food is safe," the barman assured Race. "I do the cooking myself. We don't have a lot in, though." He eyed the elf at the bar suspiciously, but there was no fear in his words as he said, "The elves want us to keep them fed, but they don't supply us with the food to do so. Nevertheless, I can offer you some chicken, pork, or if you prefer, I can knock up a salad." "Harpies are carnivores," the elf told the barman. "Oh, well, chicken or pork then." "But we don't have a lot of either," the barman said. "You 4 might be better off hunting for yourselves," the elf suggested. "We tried," Race commented. "There's nothing much out there." "I wish I understood what was being said," Quinagoff commented. "Don't worry," Gaggara assured her. "It's nothing important. Handsome is just trying to order us some food." The elf glanced briefly towards Quinagoff and Gaggara, then asked, "So, where are you 4 going?" That was the sort of question that Race had wanted to avoid. At least the elf asking the question was doing so for the sake of conversation, and not because he wanted to interrogate the harpy. "We're heading south," Race said simply. "South?" the elf commented. "Just the 4 of you?" No, Race replied. "Our entire village is headed south. We 4 are just out doing a little bit of hunting." "Hunting," the elf commented. "In an inn?" Race shrugged, and then gave the elf an answer that he felt fitted in with his own existence as a harpy. "I told you, there is no food out there. We can't catch enough for ourselves, let alone for our village. Since we huntresses are vital to the security of our village, we felt that we at least should be well fed. So, here we are." The elf laughed and grinned. "Harpies," he commented. "What?" Race acted innocent. He resisted the urge to grin himself. It was still very cold in the streets of the city when, after an hour, Race and his companions emerged from the inn. Race wished he could stay in the warmth of the barroom, if only for another 5 minutes. But he knew that they had to continue their journey to the south while the weather was still bearable. The sun had moved very little in the hour they had been under cover. In that time, though, the first snows of the predicted blizzard had begun to fall. It wasn't bad as of yet. It was little more than a gentle flurry. It was just the overture. The food the barman had cooked for them had been meagre at best, and yet there had been more food on their plates than they had been able to catch and cook all morning. Furthermore, the food had been better prepared. It might not have been much, but it would help to fuel their wings for another few hours at least. "Let's go," Race urged. He didn't want to hang around, and the activity of flying would help keep him a little bit warmer. "Maybe we can even reach First Town before nightfall." "I doubt it," Gaggara replied, looking at the sky. "But we can try." "Well," Race accepted, "maybe we can find a nice inn to spend the night in at Borton, or failing that, Sun's Blessing." "You're obsessed," Gaggara replied with a grin. Quinnigoff led the way again. Soon they were flying over the border of Lemaise. Lemaise was a long, thin dukedom. If Race remembered his geography lessons correctly, it bordered no less than 9 other dukedoms, and even had a small amount of beach right on the eastern coast of the country. On the other hand, it was a very narrow dukedom, as if it was just slotted into place when all the rest of Florida had been allotted. It was also unique in that not one of the major cities of the land sat directly on the King's Highway. Race had heard that at its fittest point the dukedom was a mere 13 miles wide. At the point where the King's Highway bisected the dukedom, it was still only about 50 miles and took just over 3 hours to cross. Race remembered the last time he had flown over this part of the country. Back then it had been just him and Gaggara. The land had been so beautiful, the wildlife frolicking in the forest so prevalent and everything so green and vibrant. That same land now looked pitiful, covered as it was in a thick blanket of snow. Sun's blessings should be just up ahead, Race commented as they flew over a sign welcoming them to the Dukedom of Borton. The sign was written in flourish and had evidently survived all the rampant elvenisation of the land. Actually, Race didn't know how far into Borton Sun's blessing really was, since it had been dark when he had last flown this way, but he felt as if it couldn't be that much further. You still want to stop there, Gaggara commented doubtfully. I have to, Race replied simply. I have to give Agnart a chance. It was getting close to dinner time when Race saw the distinctive building of the Ploughman's Arms up ahead. That's it, Race called to Quinnigoff. Land there. Yes, my chief, Quinnigoff replied. She seemed to take Race literally at his word and landed on the roof of the inn, dislodging a little of the snow into the village below. The village of Sun's Blessing looked very much like every other village they had passed on their long flight to the south. There were a few elves in the street, and a few humans hard at various types of work, none of whom had any kind of chain denoting their position as slaves, and yet there could be no doubt in Race's mind that these people were indeed slaves. I can't see any harpies here at all, Gaggara commented. Actually, Race replied, I do see one. There, in the very centre of the village green, only a few feet from the village well, was a kind of scaffold built from the trunks of 3 trees. Hanging by her wrist and ankles from these scaffold were the remains of a long-dead huntress. Clearly she had been executed. Most likely she had been tied here and left to freeze or starve to death. The extreme cold of this endless winter had also helped preserve her body, but even so, there was a fair amount of deterioration. Race left the roof of the inn and landed a short distance from the scaffold. Agnart? Gaggara asked worriedly as she landed next to her husband. I hope not, Race replied. It was hard to be sure, although she did seem to be about the same age as Agnart. Race hated to think that maybe she'd been killed in response to helping Race and Gaggara escape. No. Race refused to accept that this was Agnart. His good friend and teacher was still alive somewhere, probably back in her village. She would still be getting abused by her peers, but at least she was alive. It is Agnart, Gaggara uttered, saying the words that Race didn't want to hear. There are no other harpies here, my chief, Quinnigoff commented, standing behind Race and checking the area carefully. Those who conquered this village have long since moved on. They could be anywhere by now. Race looked at Quinnigoff and nodded. It was the same thing with our village before you took over, my chief, Quinnigoff pointed out. We were given orders to take control of a small village called Clayford, which sat just outside the city of Borton. We were only supposed to stay until the elven forces moved in to replace us. Race sighed. He looked again at the hanging harpy. Even now he didn't want to admit that this might be Agnart. The more he thought about it, though, the more he felt he recognised some of the features of the corpse beside him. Race called his sword out of the hammerstone and cut the body down. I'd like to bury her. But my chief, Quinnigoff cautioned, we don't have the time. Why bother? Tanegi asked. It does seem a waste of effort, my chief, Quinnigoff voiced. Even Gaggara didn't seem to understand why Race cared so much about burying the dead harpy. She isn't going to care. I'd like to bury her, Race insisted. We have nothing to bury her with, Gaggara told him. No, Race admitted sadly. I guess we don't. We should leave her to the elves, Quinnigoff suggested. If they want to bury her, let them do it, my chief. I guess you're right, Race said with a heavy sigh, although it did occur to him that the elves would simply order their human slaves to do the actual digging. At least her suffering is over, Gaggara offered, trying to console him. Race looked down at the body. He was beginning to believe it might be Agnart, but he was still loath to accept it. Agnart, if you were Agnart, I'm sorry I wasn't here to help you. Then he looked up at Tanegi, then at Gaggara, and finally at Quinnigoff, saying, Okay, let's get back into the air. Lead the way, there's nothing for us here after all.